Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading from the One Year Bible, and we examine some questions that extend our learning from the Sermon on Sunday. Today I'm joined by Rivenbark and Alyssa Bream, and we're looking at a passage from Luke chapter 16. So I'm going to read a little bit of the passage, but it says, Jesus said there was a certain rich man who was splendidly clothed in purple and fine linen, who lived each day in luxury. At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores. And so this man is begging. Lazarus is begging. And so when we read stories like this, especially those found in the Bible, I think one of our natural tendencies is to compare ourselves with characters that we read about. So when you read this particular parable, do you relate more or see yourself more like the rich man, or do you see yourself more like Lazarus?
Well, the reality is I don't want to be either one necessarily, because there's such contrast between the two of them. You got the rich man with his fine clothes, his food that he eats, his house. Then you contrast him with Lazarus, who has these sores. He's begging for scraps to eat. And he's apparently living on the street is what it seems to be. And then you see with the rich man, that's the part I think we all would like to identify with. You know, we got it made, we've arrived, we've done good. But his spiritual condition here, it appears that he's arrogant and greedy and presumptuous, and he's even a Jew because he calls Abraham father. But then you see Lazarus, who's actually the righteous man. And so the story draws the point, is it better to have things here or eternity the goal? And I think sometimes the question is, can there be a balance between the two? But they're extremes one way or the other. Ultra rich in this story and the very poor man. Want to be somewhere in the middle usually.
Yeah. So what kind of insights do you get from the story, Alyssa, about yourself maybe?
Maybe more so than identifying with a single person in the story, it should make us ask some personal inventory questions like, am I greedy? Am I self-absorbed? Am I presumptuous about my spiritual condition? Because that's what we see with the rich man who just doesn't understand what's going on there. Is my current situation in life more like the rich man or Lazarus? Like, you know, there was no middle class there. You were rich or poor. Is my eternal situation more like the rich man's or Lazarus? And that's the really important one. I think every person needs to be able to give themselves an honest spiritual inventory in their life. You need to be able to do an audit of yourself as you, like, what is good, what is bad, what do I need to work on, and know your spiritual condition.
Yeah. And so our theme for the week, this is a follow-up to a sermon on evangelism, right? And sharing the gospel with others. And so whether we're dealing with, you know, this self-absorbed rich man or this suffering beggar on the street, both of them are going to face eternity. Everybody needs the gospel, right? So how do we keep from responding to people in a stereotypical fashion, right? Assuming that all wealthy people are greedy, or assuming that all homeless people are lazy, or that they have put themselves in a bad situation. How do we keep from doing that?
You have to start with knowing that people, when we meet them, we're meeting them at one point in their life, and there's a whole story of how they got there. I think that's one of the reasons why I really like documentaries, because you get to dive into someone's life or a situation and kind of see all of the details, and that helps us to know that there's more to the story. And I think if you can keep that in your head, that this person might have had trauma, this person maybe was born rich, but they had parents that weren't around, or knowing that there's more to the story, and maybe even in conversation seeking to find that, I think will help maybe break some of those stereotypes that can get stuck in our head.
Yeah, I would agree. For me, it is the realization that everybody does have a story, and what you see on the surface is not necessarily even the big part of the story. But it's easy to make assumptions. You see people driving certain cars, dressing a certain way, living in certain areas, and that it's easy to say, well, they've got it together. That's what I want to be, and that's what I want to have. But you don't know the turmoil behind or in their life, you know, whether it be in relationships or their relationship with God. And the same with people who appear not to have anything. I saw someone this morning, and I've seen them a couple of times, that, at least on the surface, it seems like they would meet the definition of Lazarus. Just doesn't have anything in this life. The reality is they may be the most content, happy person that I've seen today. I don't know for sure, but they certainly could be. But it's easy to judge people by what we see, but to understand that everybody has a story. And if we can try to understand that, I think it kind of levels the playing field a little bit. And so that we don't automatically say, they're this, they're that, therefore I'm going to have nothing to do with them. We'll try to encourage them.
The greatest success I have ever had trying to break stereotypes is just having conversations with people, whether they're homeless or wealthy, because then you do get to hear their story. You don't have to assume what it was. Sometimes it is completely different than what you expected. Other times it is maybe what you would have thought it was. And I think we have to also remember where we've been and where we've come from. That's also a great way for us to break stereotypes, because I think that when we realize, okay, I was that, or I am that, and I'm not whatever, then that doesn't mean everybody is. And so, I've met lazy rich people, right? And I've met greedy poor people.
Yeah.
It has, and you have to be able to distinguish between the two. So what is our responsibility to the people right outside of our doors?
Well, whether they meet the definition of the rich man or the poor man, Lazarus, I think our responsibility is to love people. You said have conversation with them, get to know people, look for opportunities to speak into their life, to encourage them, challenge them, and particularly as it relates to evangelism, be alert and aware of opportunities to speak the truth of the gospel to them, regardless of what social status they have.
Right. Our first responsibility has to be to represent Christ well, like you said. These weeks I'm preparing for a journey to the cross, and throughout that there's been a quote that has been, I think, almost every single year, like the single greatest cause of atheism in the world is Christians who don't live it out in their lifestyle. It is said much more eloquently than that, but that's by Brendan Manning. And I think that will cause people not to listen to what words you say. It doesn't matter if you have the greatest sermon in the world. If you can't back it up with the actions and the morals and the goodness towards people, it's not going to matter.
Or at least the acknowledgement when you don't get it right.
Right.
Because everybody's going to have bad days. Somebody's going to walk in on you, and the goodness of God is not going to be what rolls out. Right. It's just the awareness of, hey, I shouldn't have done that. I think that's one of the struggles is Christians behave in certain manners and then either are unaware that they act that way or are unwilling to repent or acknowledge it. Yeah. So is it easier to share the gospel with a rich man or a beggar who is hungry and suffering?
I think it depends on your definition of easier. Because there's two ways that I took this, and maybe you're like, duh, Alyssa, this is how I ask the questions. Because sometimes I read these, and then as we're talking, I'm like, wow, I answered the wrong question. Is it easier for me to go up to a rich person and talk to them or a poor person? But also then, are they more receptive? Are they going? And I think that those are maybe different answers. It might be easier to talk to one or the other depending on your personal life experiences growing up. But, we think that rich people have it all made and that they're not going to listen to that gospel, but sometimes they are the people that are hurting more than ever. I can think of stories of people that were rich and miserable. So I don't think we can say it's easier one way or the other, but maybe Jay has the perfect answer.
I'm going to give it my best shot. I think going back to talk about the stereotypes, I think the presumption is that it's easier to share with people who don't have anything. Because when we reach out with kindness, whether to give them a gift card or buy them a meal, that all of a sudden here's this perfect opportunity, and it may be the perfect opportunity to talk to them about the love of Jesus in their life. But as Alyssa said, the wealthy person who's experienced that side of life, but yet is still empty and void, may be just as desperate or more desperate to hear the truth of the gospel than the person who appears to have little or nothing.
Desperate, but whether we're willing to talk to them or not.
That's right, but I do think, and I'm speaking from personal experience too, there is some, I think, intimidation at times, or certainly can be, to people particularly that we when I say we know, we don't really know anything, but by what we see and hear are really, really wealthy and have a lot of the world's goods. I think there's some intimidation that goes along with that they're going to reject us, reject the gospel. And so I think we tend to lean toward the less fortunate.
There's a couple of things I would say. And it's just some of the circles that I happen to be running in right this minute, or have the privilege. That's not true. I get to stand on the side of the street and watch them run. I think it's probably more what's happening.
Don't be ashamed of
it. There is a particular missions organization that we support here at Open Door, and they're very clear that their aim is for the top 10% to reach in the world. And they give all of these statistics, which are true. The overwhelming majority of missions organizations go to the bottom 10%. And their argument is, if we can evangelize the top 10%, it will filter down, right? That they have influence that they will send down. There's a couple of other places I would point to. Just yesterday on a mentoring call, Chris Hodges was sharing that when you're meeting with business people, you want to, he used a word, it wasn't an inventory, but he said you want to ask questions to find out what they need, right? So you listen to what they're saying. And then he said, once you find out what they need, then you can speak to it, right? Mm-hmm. Don't walk into a wealthy person trying to tell them how to manage their money, because they're probably better at it than you. Mm-hmm. But ask them questions. Is their marriage suffering? Are their kids in trouble? Are their parents aging? And then you have the opportunity to speak to them. But it's not as obvious when somebody has all the trappings of life, looks good. But it does, there are people who have more influence than others, so this is the second time in 2 weeks that I have come across this person. So there's a guy named Scott Turner, who's the HUD secretary in this current administration. And my son asked me, he said, did you hear him pray at the cabinet meeting? And I said, no, I didn't. And he said, you should go back and watch it. So the first cabinet meeting that they had a few weeks back. So I went back, and you can find the prayers separated out. And so he's invited up, and he stands up and he comes and prays a big, what's the word? Off the cuff. There's a word for praying that way, where you're not reading it, but you're just
extemporaneous.
Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. I knew it started with E, but I just couldn't get it out of my brain. It was somewhere stuck in there. It struck my son enough that he wanted to tell somebody about it. And that is an environment where you don't hear, especially that kind of prayer prayed in that room. And then today a reel came across, and he's in the Dream Center in Los Angeles, which that was the very first one. And they've got hundreds of volunteers in there who are going out to serve, and he's in there praying over them, right? It's just a really powerful thing. He has a different influence than I do, right? Wherever he goes, there's news cameras there filming everything he does. And so when he prays, there are lots of people listening. That's not true for me. And so there is some truth to listen before anybody walks away from this conversation and says, oh, he said we should focus on, the wealthy people. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying you can't focus on, what I would say is you can't focus on one to the exclusion of the other, because both have benefits. Jesus told us to take care of the least of these, but he also ministered to other people who had other needs, because they have just as great as spiritual needs. And I think it's some of it has more to do with what we believe about ourselves than about them. That's what I would say. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around our daily Bible reading from the One Year Bible.